we'll go ahead and get started. I encourage you guys to keep eating if you want to while I talk, not a problem at all. I'll give a few words of introduction, then talk about analytics, and then we'll have a Q&A time and close it out right at 1. If you guys need to leave before we're wrapped up, please don't feel shy about doing so. Just everybody's busy, and we know that you guys have other things in your day. So just wanted to give you permission to duck out. We are infoFluency. My name's Robin Sturgis. This is my coworker Becca Skelly and Kirsten Robinson. And we do a couple of different things. Data implementation of software, most commonly Salesforce, and analytics. And we'll talk about quite a few of those things while we're going through. And just to jump in, I wanted to have a little fun with analytics right off the bat. If you guys would pull out your phones and go to menti.com on your phone browser, you'll be prompted for this code. And when you enter it, that will allow us to have an anonymous poll. It's only 3 questions, but it will give a sense of a little bit of the complexion of the room here, which will help me, but also it's just kind of fun. Oh, right, sorry. There you go. 343309. Oh, good idea. All right, I'm going to jump to show us the live results, which is the fun of this. Which means we can tell who's voted, how many people have voted and how many people have not. So as you guys are answering, it's letting us know live how many founders we have, how many managers we have, and how many in another sort of category we have. So I'm going to move to the next slide and we'll see what the other answers are. All right, you guys haven't answered the second question yet.
Still pondering the first.
Still pondering. Am I a ponder?
Oh,
there we go. Good, good. Super helpful to have a sense of what you guys are using. And no one on Salesforce, that is actually a 1. That's helpful information. All right, let's see. Best describes your analytics use. Frequently, occasionally, or have some sort of intention. Okay, let's just scroll back and see. Still looking about the same. Our biggest percentage is Excel, that's interesting. And biggest percentage is founders. Okay, thank you guys for that. That's helpful and hopefully kind of fun. All right. Indulge me while I navigate around here. Okay. Whoops. Let's dive in. So what even is analytics? I think it's helpful just to have a working definition. It is the scientific process of discovering and communicating the meaningful patterns in data. But I would just say analytics is just finding stuff out from what's in your data. Plain and simple. We throw around the term visual analytics, which just means your data in pictures. And the reason we do that, which I'm sure is obvious, but is because that enables your brain to process the information. Visuals uses the components of size and color, relative shape and relative position to allow your brain to make sense of that data in a way that you can't if you're just looking at a huge bank of numbers. Also want to address the question of why would we even use analytics, and why is that helpful as a person who is founding a business or trying to manage part or all of a business? And it's because the biggest decision, the biggest reason to use analytics is because data-driven decisions are superior to a gut level decision in running your business, but also to measure progress, to be aware of the state of your business in a way that you can't when you just, we think we know what the state of our business is, but when we look at the data, we might find out that we were a little off. And then additionally, data helps us avoid mistakes and sometimes costly ones. And another reason for analytics is because stakeholders might be demanding them of us, especially companies who are raising funding. Investors are going to want data and analytics from you. All right, here's a couple of examples. These are all dashboard format, but I'll say every one of the components in this dashboard is considered analytics in and of itself. Couple more examples, and then we'll move on. Okay, I want to kind of speak to analytics in 4 phases, starting with data and then going into KPIs, which is just a measurement. It means a key performance indicator. It's just a measurement, and we'll talk a lot more about that. Then we'll look at analytics themselves and then look at how those will play into making decisions. Okay, so let's start with data. And on these slides that follow, you're going to see where we are in the phases kind of marked on the slides to give a framework. So to start thinking about where your data is, think about the applications that you use to run your business in the different areas of business where you would be storing data. And I would venture to say that even if you're not an analytics user and you're not a heavy application user, I bet you have data somewhere. If you have a website, you have data somewhere. So I'll just toss out some examples. If you have a contact relationship manager, like a Salesforce or a HubSpot or something along those lines, you've got data there. If you have a website, you have access to Google Analytics, you've got data there. If you're on social media, you've got data there. In your financials, if you're using an application to handle customer service or project management, all of those places you have data. When we talk about where your data is, we use a term called a tech stack. And it's basically just a diagram of what applications you're using and where the data lives that you want to exploit to get answers and get insight. So this is one way to diagram a tech stack. Here's another. And it's just helpful to prompt us to think, where are the places in our organization where we can go after data? So that brings us to the very first of a couple of parts of this exercise that I'd love to walk us through. And I've got an example on the right-hand side here, I guess maybe your left. And you've got a handout on the table. And I'll give you just a minute. I don't intend to spend enough time for you guys to really get all the way through this. But the idea being that you go through each area of your business and acknowledge whether or not you have some kind of application that you're using in that area. The first one on my example, it's probably really hard to read, but in the sales area, we're using Salesforce, and then we're answering the question whether or not that application has analytics already built into it. If you go further down to the very bottom of my example here, I'm showing customer service and I'm showing none, because I think it's important not to only acknowledge where we have data, but where we don't have data, because those are holes that we might need to address where we have need, and that should prompt us to go looking for an application that would give us the data that we need in that area. So I'll give you just a quick minute to jot some things down, and then I'll move us on to our next part of this exercise. And I'm sure you'll see on your handout that there are KPIs, but those are for the second part of our exercise. So no need to go there yet.
Would you say that QuickBooks has built-in analytics?
Minimally. Wendy, would you agree with that?
Different data, but you still have to know how to pull. Well, first you pull the data, but then the interpretation of the data is hard. And sometimes what you look at doesn't really mean what is it. So QuickBooks is just it's not right now. It's not in a format that it still require a lot of interpretations.
Okay, feel free in this whole exercise, take this with you and continue to mull over it. Okay, defining KPIs for your business. We all would look at different KPIs depending on our business. This is a really unique question specific to each of us. And so I would have you think through this in terms of what area you need to be aware of, what area you need to watch, where in your business do you need to make decisions, and where in your business do you need to provide reporting, either for yourself or for someone else. So an example of that would be sales or revenue or expenses. All those are areas where you need to be aware as a founder. You need to be watching those things, making decisions and reporting. And so for the next phase of your exercise, I would encourage you to think through what are a couple of KPIs per area. And again, those are just measurements, what you might want to track. And I'll give you some examples here. Again, this is our exercise. Examples are coming. Over here on the right, I've just written some different different things that I might want to track. Like website traffic or year-over-year revenue or seasonality of expenses. And here's even more examples. And I'll leave these up while you guys jot down what makes sense for you. But here's just some ideas that a lot of businesses need to track. So you might need to be looking at how much it costs you to acquire a client. You might need to think through client acquisition, what your rate of that is, or your client attrition. Hopefully not too much, but what your sales are by product so that you can make emphasis decisions, seasonality decisions, etc. So I'll leave this for you, and there's so many more, but hopefully this get you thinking. Okay, we'll move on. I know that doesn't give you much time, but we'll come back to that. Okay, we've talked about data, we've talked about KPIs, and now we're going to talk about using those KPIs to think through visualizing those measurements in a way that helps us make decisions and is analytical. So on the right, I've tossed out some types of visualizations that are useful. And the key here is to choose a visualization type that fits what you're trying to measure. An example would be if you want something that shows relative proportional size, you're going to use a tree map, which is, I think I have a pointer here. We're going to make this work, maybe. Well, whatever. The tree map is the one that has different colors and boxes, or a pie chart, or at the very bottom, a bubble chart. Those, show relative amounts and sizes, versus if you want something on a timeline, if you want to measure seasonality or something like that, you're going to choose a bar chart or a line chart, something that's on a time axis. Those are pretty obvious, but my point here is that you want to choose a visualization that fits what you're trying to measure. Another example would be the stock chart that's at the bottom, second from bottom on the right, which just shows a concentration of data in one specific distribution area.
Well,
And
I'm thinking of a situation where it's high client turnover. What kind of chart would you choose to show acquisition and retention?
That's a great question. I've seen that done. That's actually an example I'm going to talk about a little later. I've seen it done where the that's calculated in terms of a percentage and then ranked. So you can see where that's really a problem. You can also use a heat map, which I think is the top middle there, and you can show the concentration of the percentages and see, you know, where on the visualization there's a problem. That helps there. All right. So I'll give you guys a second if you want to just kind of jot down maybe a visualization or two that would correspond with the KPIs that you wrote down. And this is not something I realize that you can do in a minute, but hopefully you'll get a little taste of it. And then we'll move on to our third part of our exercise. So I'll just talk a little bit about how I did this. So an example, start to finish for us, is in our lineup of technology, we have QuickBooks. And one of the KPIs that is interesting is projects by billable hours. And so for us, I put that across a time axis, and it's interesting because this chart shows a couple of different things. Not only does it show what projects have the highest concentration of revenue through the lens of billable hours, but it also shows the trend over time. And you can see the changes as they pass through the months of the year. And I want to also point out that this chart is using size, both in the overall size of every bar, as well as the size of every bar component or every project. Not only that, it's using color, it's using time on the axis. And in addition to that, it's helpful to note that your brain instantly realizes, without you even mentally thinking about it, that there are 12 bars here, and that means that you're looking at a year's worth of data. So if I put the same chart up here and it had 3 out of 12 bars, your brain would instantly say, this is partial year's data, we're only looking at a quarter. And you don't have to think about that, but because of the visuals, your brain just jumps to that automatically. That makes sense. Okay, so a word about dashboards. Dashboards are particularly helpful because they bring together a variety of different metrics that you're looking at in one place. And for a person who is managing a lot of different aspects of the business, like a founder, it's just particularly helpful because it consolidates everything that you're trying to look at. And it also oftentimes shows some kind of a correlation between one area and what's happening in another area. If you have those visualizations spread out and they're not in a place where you can see them together, then it's harder to draw those conclusions between those, you know, what's happening over here is actually affecting what's happening over here. All right, how are we on time? We're good. Am I going too fast? I feel like I'm speaking really fast. Okay. All right, so a couple of words about some dashboard best practices. You can actually read entire textbooks on dashboard construction, so I won't bore you with that. But a couple of things is that you want your metrics as of a certain point in time to be their biggest component. So you see these bigger numbers, this revenue month to date here at the top is a big, super visible number. across the top, front and center, and in big enough type that you can just easily see it. And as you move down the dashboard, you go from your highest level, least granular data down to the more detailed data. And that's a flow that's done on purpose in good dashboard design. If you see a dashboard where you have the most important information on the bottom, it probably wasn't designed very thoughtfully. Also, just a side note is that good dashboard design also should allow you to drill down on any one of the components in this dashboard and see the detail that underlies it. Because dashboards are meant to cause you to ask questions. So, you know, I might look at this and I might see in that pie chart that very dark red sliver, and I say, what is under that and why is that so small? And so what's your natural inclination? You're going to say, I need to know what makes that up, what's underneath that sliver. And so with good design, you can, ideally it's interactive, you can click on it and get the underlying data that made up that sliver. Let's see, what else?
Can I add something to that?
Yes,
One
please.
thing that I like about dashboards too, or just visualizing your data in general, it also helps you find bad data. And if
Great
something
point.
doesn't look right and you're able to drill down into it, there might be something wrong with the data that's in there. It really helps you clean your data as well to be able to visualize that.
That's a fantastic point. And I'll add to that is that it's important to think through the business processes that you have that might be causing you to have bad data. And I'll give an example of that. If you have data somewhere that includes addresses and you have 5 different ways that you have Texas entered, that means that you have 5 different, your visualization thinks there's 5 different states when really there's only one. So if your business process forces you to always enter capital T, capital X, then your data is going to be a lot cleaner than if sometimes you enter TEXAS and sometimes you enter TX and sometimes you capitalize it and sometimes you don't. You get the point. So think through, especially if your company is new and you have the luxury of creating processes, try to create clean processes. It'll pay off in the long run, I promise. Okay, so I want to talk just a little bit about how a dashboard might be constructed from the beginning point of where we've come, talking about our data, talking about our KPIs, talking about the analytics we might want to put together. Then what? How do you construct a dashboard? So here's a picture of one that I mocked up, and this is using this word wireframe, but it's basically just a diagram that helps you walk through creating this. And I know it's a little bit hard to see, but in the top, you've got the goal of the dashboard, which is, for me, on this particular one, it's just to stay updated on the state of the business. And then under that, I've listed my KPIs. I know that I want to know what my revenue is per month, what my current month's expense is, along with that expense running over time. I want to know what my profit is by the type of service we're providing. In some businesses, that would be the product. So you see here, this would be my profit number as of in the current snapshot in time. But then next to it, I've put a ranked bar chart and colored it by business line. So I can see, you know, how are our Salesforce projects doing as far as profit goes as compared to our analytics projects, for instance. A couple other things that I put here, then I'm tracking the number of our active projects, how we're trending on social media and the engagement we're getting there. And I'll stop to mention that I color coded these on the side to show where the data came from. So for this whole side of the dashboard, it's financial data from QuickBooks or wherever financial data lives. The purple one at the bottom is from Google Analytics and from our social media platforms. So I'm just trying to acknowledge what data source is feeding that piece. And I want to mention just a little, I hope you're on time. I mentioned just a little bit about this funny thing I have over here that's called CAC, which is your customer acquisition cost. So think through, how much are you having to spend to bring that customer on. That's a pretty important thing when you're trying to analyze your profitability. And then there is something that we have done that's related to that called the influence analyzer. And so I might put that specific chart next to my average CAC. And what the influence analyzer does is it takes a look at, I should have given you a picture of it, but it's an area chart, and it looks as the number of interactions that you had to bring someone from being a prospect to bringing them to being a client. And so you might have, it depends on your business model. You might have, you know, if you're website sales, you might have no interactions other than that person jumping on your website. But if you have a sales cycle that lasts a year, you know, you might have 200 touches with that client before they sign on. So you have to put it in terms of your own business, but it's important to think through how much is required to turn that opportunity into a client. All right, that was kind of a diversion there, so hopefully that was interesting to somebody. Okay, so let's go with an example or two to kind of recap and try to bring all of this together. So you remember at the beginning we talked about going through these phases of data, measurement, analytics, and then decisions. And welcome, would you like to join us?
Yes.
Okay, good, come on in. An example from one of my clients, they had need for a scheduling application. So we helped them figure out one that would be fitting for their requirements, and we implemented it. And once they had all that store of appointment data, they wanted to make some use of it. They started to define some KPIs and landed on one of the most important, being client attrition. They were seeing in their business, they have a number of employees, and those employees each have oversight of a certain subset of the clients. And they were wanting to find out if they had a problem with any given employee who was really losing clients over time. So the analytic that they chose to look at was a rank of employees by their attrition percentage. And when they looked at that, they discovered that there were a couple at the very top that had the highest percentage of lost clients. And so they made the data-driven decision to provide resources and mentoring for those strugglers. And they continue to look at that month to month, and it's possible that over time there'll be people that they need to allow to go on to a different opportunity. So another example, another client, they had a ton of sales data that they weren't doing anything with, and they found that they didn't really even know who their biggest revenue producing clients were. So they also chose a ranking, and they ranked their clients by revenue. The most simple visualization you could probably come up with. But what they discovered was they had a client that was giving more revenue than anybody else by far, and they did not even know who this client was. Now, this was a company whose sales is typically done online, so it's not completely unreasonable that they would not know who the client was. But the client was so much bigger than the others that they made the data-driven decision to get somebody on an airplane right away to go and visit this client and start to create a nurtured relationship with them and hold on to them. So those are a couple of examples, kind of end to end, of how firms have walked through this process to get them to a point where they're making data-driven decisions. All right. I want to say a little word about what I'm going to call distributed analytics versus consolidated analytics, which I'll talk about in a minute. So distributed analytics might be where a good number of us sit, where you have data and analytics in all of these different places, the majority of which actually give you their own analytics within the application, like a Salesforce. you know, gives you some analytics. Google Analytics, by its name, gives you analytics. QuickBooks, as we talked about, not so much, but a little bit. So you have analytics that you don't have to work really hard to get. But my point here is that they are distributed, which means that you can't look at them as a whole and put them together on a dashboard very easily. I will note that you could PDF them, or you could drop them into a PowerPoint and you could try to sort of manually look at them together, manually consolidate them. But a better approach, or a more useful approach, is a consolidated analytic approach where you take an application in the middle of the process, like a Tableau, which is a visual analytics tool. That's our favorite one, but there are loads of others out there. Sometimes people call those BI tools or business intelligence tools. But the concept being is that you put something in the middle of this process, like a Tableau, and it reaches out and accesses the data that are in all these different platforms and allows you to create something consolidated where you can see your website traffic next to your sales, next to your revenue and expenses.
What are some other engines?
There's one called Domo. There's one called, I think it's a Microsoft product. Power BI, thank you. Spotfire, yes, and ClickView. There's a good number of them out there. This one is just the example I use because it's my favorite.
Thank you, Jenny.
Good point.
To use Tableau to pull access data, or would it be better to customize work in your access data?
It depends on your use case, I would say. I mean, you could definitely use Access to consolidate data from a bunch of different places, and then Access does do a little bit of charting. You could go with it that way for sure, if that met your needs. And if you didn't need something quite this big for, I mean, this is a fairly, it's not an enormous solution, but it might be more than you need.
That's the nice thing with the Tableau. You can do the manipulation on the data from your Access database without changing the base data. So
That's Kirsten makes a great point, because the one that I didn't mention is that because Tableau is reaching out here to look at your data, it doesn't store your data. It goes out and allows you to view it in the place that it lives. So if it's looking at Excel, it doesn't touch your spreadsheet or change what's in your spreadsheet. It just allows you to see, these are the columns I have, these are the rows I have, and what am I going to do with it? Yes. Yes. So that's a great point too. And before I talk on that a bit, I want to mention that you can do calculations in the Tableau layer, and those are, it's pretty powerful for that. So that's really helpful, especially when you're consolidating. You might want to bring in fields that live in all these different places and still be able to perform calculations on them. Wendy's point about interactivity and the freshness of the data is a good one, because with something like this, your visualizations can live in the cloud, and you can have interactive access where you can change the filters and, you know, look at a certain sales territory or look at a certain year. So as the end user, you can really, you know, drill down and get a lot of more specific answers that way. And you can have a live connection so that when you do have changes in your data source, Tableau's pulling those in live, and you have real-time data. In fact, I had a client who was doing that, pulling Google Analytics, and they had Tableau up on a TV screen in the lobby of their office, and they just showed page hits on their website as they were happening, which is kind of cool. That was the same client who didn't know where their biggest client was. So they're getting really excited about analytics and really using it for a lot of cool purposes. Okay, I'm going to pause a little bit here for questions, and also let you know that Becca is willing to walk through some analytics within the Salesforce environment specifically for those who are interested. And she'll kind of do that aside because I know that not all of you are Salesforce users. So, questions?
We should ask that guy why he's late.
Yeah, why are you late?
Lord Sturgis.
This guy is my husband, so we're allowed to pick on him. No, not mine.
If you were to, make a presentation to a client, what's your process? How do you work with selling your product?
It depends on what they're interested in. So if they're interested in Salesforce, we might talk about what processes in their business that tool can address. If they're completely focused on analytics, I would give them some examples. A lot of the material we've talked about here about why it's beneficial to them. And a lot of the time, if people are interested in analytics, what they're struggling with is their data. And so we would a lot of times start with addressing their problems in their data. And a lot of times we can use analytics to even expose what those problems are. If you put a chart on something and there's this huge outlier, that's really telling, and a lot of times that takes you back to bad data. Does that answer that question? Okay.
I suppose with Tableau or any other program like that, you could use it for something other than customer data. You could go to vendors, you track your expenses with that vendor and say, hey, Joe Steel Manufacturer, I spent $5 million with you last year, what can we do? Or you can see that your costs have risen over the past years with this vendor, maybe it's time to look at another vendor.
I have an excellent example of that. One of our clients realized that their expenses were a little out of control, and when they drilled down to find what was happening in their expenses, they realized that they had spent $50,000 in the prior 12 months on credit card fees, because their clients were almost always paying with credit card. And so they went to their bank and said, what are we going to do? And they ended up changing banks. So that's a great example of that exact kind of.
And there was something like Tableau as well. I guess whatever QuickBooks, Salesforce, Excel, whatever it is, I guess kind of like what you said earlier, you've got to have your data pretty much the same however you do it. So like when you've got to tell Tableau to talk to Excel, but it's got to know where to go, I guess, obviously. If you've got stuff scattered every which way, you've got Texas with the T, capital TX,
yes,
etc. It's going to mess up your report.
Right. As well as not only the data itself, but the structure of that data. A lot of people use Excel in a way that leaves a lot of blank space or a lot of totals, things like that, which are super helpful if all you want to do is stay in Excel. But once you pull it into a Tableau environment, if you've got totals in there and you include those total lines, you might be, grossly overstating the numbers. I mean, you have a structure consideration as well as a data quality consideration. Yes, a lot of times, actually most often they say, we want to be able to measure this, and then we'll build them a dashboard, give it to them to react, and then it becomes iterative until they get it just how they want it. And then in that process, we're discovering the data problems or restructuring some of the data. And, it brings in some other things. It's not just, typically not just dashboard design. Yeah.
So is the dashboard showed up in Apple?
Yes, so Tableau has a desktop version, which if you're only one of you, then that's perfectly fine, but it also has a cloud option where you can publish your data sources and publish your visualizations in the cloud, and then multiple people can access them, interact with them, change the filters, that kind of thing, and drill down, look at things in aggregate and things in detail. And that becomes really powerful when you have a team that needs to be looking at the visualizations, or if you have different visualizations for different areas. You know, your sales team might need their own set of dashboards, and you know, you might need something for a product process or a manufacturing process, and it just sort of grows from there. But from a management perspective, if you're only one person, you can just use the desktop version and run with it. Does that make sense? Yeah. We do recently have started offering kind of a low-cost entry point to Tableau Online, because Tableau did change their licensing. And so now for your company to just go straight in with Tableau, they require you to have 6 licenses, and that might be way more than you need and more expense than you want. And so what we have been able to do with Tableau's blessing is to sub-license just a instance of Tableau, and we can lock it down with permissions so that it's only your stuff for your access, and then be able to offer you just the less expensive, smaller scale option. I guess that's a pretty good point for me to give a shameless plug about what we do. We do offer those advisory services that I mentioned, where we help a client to discover what might be a fitting application for their need, like the client that needed the scheduling software. We do work in Salesforce. Becca is our Salesforce guru, and has done a beautiful job on quite a number of Salesforce implementations and customizations. And then, of course, analytics, like we've been talking about all day long. And I also am going to ask if you would please follow us on social media. Even right this minute, if you wanted to post that you were here today, there are hashtags at the bottom that I encourage you to use. And we promise in turn to follow you back and to like and share and comment on what you post. And that gives us both the benefit of exposure to each other's social networks. In addition to that, Kirsten will be very upset with me if I don't mention that we are posting every Friday an educational series on analytics. And so we're posting that across all of our channels, and you can follow us and learn little tidbits on social media about analytics every week. All right, more questions? If not, I'm going to turn it over to Becca for anybody who wants to look at Salesforce specifically.